Good morning. Thank you all so much for showing up bright and early to hear me yammer on. My name is Tyler Vander Hoeven, and I appreciate you got that right, pronouncing my name. All right, so I'm not a front-end engineer anymore. I'm a developer advocate at the Stellar Development Foundation. I've been here for almost 5 years, but I've actually been building on Stellar since 2014. So that's almost a decade building on Stellar technology. My first day, though, at the Stellar Development Foundation was actually at Meridian in Mexico, and I gave a talk called Stellar for Everything Other Than Payments. I've always kind of seen Stellar needs to be able to do more than just payments. And Meridian's pretty special for me because it was the first time I was really involved at the Stellar Development Foundation and being able to help shape and turn the future of the software. The next Meridian, I had been working on a smart contract protocol that was actually built on top alongside, kind of almost like an L2 for Stellar called Stellar Turrets. Some of you may remember that fun program. And then the next year at Meridian, we actually were launching Soroban onto the FutureNet. So there's been this progression of kind of opening up Stellar for things other than payments. And so I'm very, very excited to be at the next Meridian, this year, to talk about how Soroban is like we're getting close to launch. All of my hopes and dreams of being able to open up innovation, kind of do whatever we want. Should we? That's irrelevant. Like we can, if we're innovators, we want to be able to do things on Stellar that other people can do, that we're not limited, and we'll make the decision as the community, as builders, on whether or not it makes sense or not. But one of the things I think that excites me the most about Stellar, about Soroban and Stellar together is, right, lots of other people. It's not that hard to look at the EVM or Ethereum and say, like, okay, there's some things that we might fix. We'd like to take an attempt at doing something better, doing something different. The problem is all of those who may attempt such a thing are going to be launching like a new L1. And so there's all kinds of issues that are going to come with that, whether it's bootstrapping liquidity, developing an ecosystem. There's so many other things you have to do besides just solving some of the problems that the EVM has. But with Stellar, we're not starting from scratch. We have you guys already. We have liquidity on the network. It's a very usable, useful, full of activity and innovation already on the network, and we're adding Soroban on top of that. It's a very unique thing to be able to solve the problems that exist in blockchain or smart contract technology, to be able to solve that and not be starting from scratch, to actually be launching that into an already very active and engaged network. But when you're talking about this interoperation between kind of launching Soroban alongside Stellar, there becomes the obvious question, all right, so if there is this interoperation between these two technologies, how are they connected? And they are connected through this concept of tokens and assets. How do we get what's on Stellar over onto Soroban? And that is through Stellar assets and Soroban tokens. So we're all familiar with Stellar assets, right? So trust lines, you have to open up the opportunity for someone to send you something. So you open up a trust line with that. That's kind of the concept of Stellar assets. Anybody that's worked with Stellar is very familiar with this process. On Soroban, it's far more traditional to the smart contract world, where you don't have to open up permission. You can kind of just send anybody anything. That would be your idea of Soroban tokens. So that's going to just be a smart contract that has some information about the asset, and then all the contracts that, other contracts or addresses that hold the balances. This is far more traditional. So how do we connect these two things? Because they are pretty dissimilar in how they work and the requirements between those two things. So how do these two things work together? That would be the Stellar asset contract. How do assets become tokens? So this is probably like if you're going to start working into, and I certainly hope you will, on Soroban, contracts and building those things, this is going to become probably the most important thing. Of all the other things you do, which will be the actually bread and butter, the interesting things that you do with Soroban, you're probably going to be dealing with, at some level, the Stellar asset contract, if for no other reason than to get XLM into the networks, right? So your native currency. If you're going to be able to do anything with an asset, the native asset, you're going to need to figure out how to use this Stellar asset contract. It's very simple. It's not complex, but it's really important that you understand how that works in the interaction. So I have taken the time to kind of just walk you through the steps that are required to get a Stellar asset, whether it's XLM or USDC or all of the other assets that exist on Stellar today, and you want to get them over into your smart contracts. This is the process by which you do that. So the Stellar asset contract is just kind of it's just a contract. It's a special contract in that it's kind of a lot of the functionality is baked right into the protocol, the Stellar protocol. So it's a special contract, but it's still just a contract. Now, I will say that I recorded all of my demos. I've been to enough talks to know trying to do something live is risky. I don't not trust our AV team, but I trust myself 2 weeks ago with QuickTime more. But these are our steps, and we'll walk through them. I'll roll the videos on kind of walking through the steps. So this is kind of a demo / talk. And I'll try to walk through all of the steps that are required to go from issuing an asset, so starting on Stellar and then moving all the way to using that custom asset on the Soroban side in a smart contract. So first you're going to issue an asset. These are the 4 steps. And again, depending on what asset you're trying to get over into Soroban, you may or may, like you're not going to issue XLM. You're not going to issue USDC, right? Those have already been issued. And in many cases, these tokens will have already been wrapped. These assets will have already been wrapped and will be available. There will be a contract that you can use on the Soroban side. So there may be some of these pieces you won't have to use. But if you're issuing a brand new asset, right, your incredible new NFT project, you'll need to issue that on the Stellar side, configure that. Then you'll need to wrap that token to where it's usable, kind of packaging that up for Soroban in a smart contract. Then you'll need to do some minting, and then of course you will use it. And I will say, I believe I may cover this in one of the videos, but wrapping is kind of a misnomer. Like that means something that it doesn't mean in Stellar. So I don't love that name, but naming things is hard. It's the thing to keep in mind is that when you're wrapping a token and you have an asset on Stellar and you want to turn it into a token on Soroban, these are not 2 separate things. There's not a version of this in Stellar and a version of this in Soroban. They're not separate assets. They're the same thing. So when you are wrapping a token, you're basically just saying, I want this asset to have like a pipeline between Stellar and Soroban. So when you do something in Soroban, it's reflected on Stellar. It's the same asset. That's actually very different than other ecosystems where wrapping actually means it's a wrapped asset. It's a different token. You've got 5 over here and 15 over here, but it's 20 total. That's not the way it works in Stellar and Soroban. They're the same network. They're the same L1. And so if you've got 5 over here on Stellar, you've got 5 over here, and it's just 5. Okay, so keep that in mind, even though the term may be slightly unhelpful. The concept is incredibly powerful, where these are not separate things. If you have an asset in Stellar, that same number exists over on Soroban. The wrapping is just a pipeline. It's a linker connecting these 2 code bases or functionalities. So anyway, let's start with our first one, issuing the asset. So if we can roll that. Click to the next one. There we go.
Let's talk about how we move a Stellar asset into a Soroban token. We link these things together so that they can be used interoperably. The first thing we're going to do is just create 2 accounts on the Stellar network. Just make sure they're funded with some lumens. The native currency of the Stellar network used for paying the fees. One will be our issuing account for our asset, and the other will be like a user account that we'll try and get those funds issued into or minted into later. Let's make sure both of these have lumens in them. And the next thing in the Stellar network, So there's a little bit different in that you can't just send arbitrary tokens to a Stellar account. It needs to opt in through the concept of a trust line. So open up a trust line to an issuing account to essentially put the mailbox out in the driveway and say, I want to receive your token. So rather than there being like an initial issuing or minting or payment from an issuing account to the user needs to start this off by opening up a trust line. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're going to build up a transaction here in the laboratory. Put that B up just a little bit. Make sure this goes through. We're going to this is a change trust operation. We'll send it some. So this is where you're going to kind of come up with the name of your token. We'll do rocks because these are so valuable. The issuer of rock is this KST address, and then the QJV is the user. Right. We will move on to sign this transaction. We just need the user's signature, so he's opening up that trust line, and we'll submit that to the network. And now the trust line should be open on the user's account. If we were to go explore this endpoint on the user's account, we'll see that they have a balance of the native asset minus the little bit, so the 10,000 that FriendBot gave us, and then the fee that was subtracted when we submitted the transaction containing the operation that opened up the trust line for rock from that issuer. So now we're kind of all configured on the Stellar side, but this can't actually be used on the Soroban side yet. So that's what we're going to need to do next. Now that we've configured, we've set up our Stellar side to be able to have this asset exist. Now we need to move over to the Soroban side and actually get this configured and wrapped so that these two Soroban Stellar sides are linked together. One thing worth noting, though, is before we get too far with the issuing of the asset, if you needed to configure the actual issuing account, so there, on the Stellar side, some of you may be aware there are some things you can do to configure an issuing account. So if you are wanting to enable auth revocable flags or clawback flags, you'll need to set those up just like you would with a normal Stellar asset. If you want those features and functions to behave normally or as they do here over on the Soroban side. So before you actually start issuing or minting tokens, you'll want to make sure that you enable the appropriate flags on the issuing account before you get too far on the wrapping side. Again, you can go back retroactively and set these things up, but if you start opening up trust lines, or if you want to make sure that trust lines need to be authorized before they can receive, you need to set up those flags before you get too far down the road with your asset token Stellar Soroban configuration.
All right. So anybody that's ever issued a Stellar asset, there's obviously nothing Soroban there. That's all very standard vanilla, just setting up a trust line. You caught that last bit too about configuring your account. It's actually pretty cool. All of the functions that exist on a Stellar asset, like there is a clawback function in Soroban, and if you've enabled your asset to have clawback, you can call that from the Soroban side, which is pretty cool, but you'd have to actually configure that. So if there are flags on your Stellar issuing account, there are corollary Soroban functions for that asset if that issuing account's been enabled for that. All right, so we've set up our asset. It hasn't been issued, but there's a trust line that's open. You've got an issuing account and a user account. The next thing to do is to go to Soroban. We're going to use the Soroban CLI. I'll run it in a minute. Where we're actually going to wrap that issued asset to where it has a deployed Stellar asset contract where we'll be able to interact with this Stellar asset on the Soroban side.
Now we can move into the actual Soroban side where we wrap up that Stellar asset into a Soroban token. So Soroban has a built-in Stellar asset contract, and then the CLI has got the Soroban CLI has got some functions, features which make it very simple to wrap up that token wrap up that asset into a Soroban token, and then begin using it on the Soroban side through the Stellar Asset contract. So if we go into our Soroban CLI, you want to make sure that you get this installed. Plenty of docs on that. There's a Soroban lab, and we'll just print out the help on that. There's a token command here and a wrap command. Inside of this, you're going to get lots of information. The ones that we need to pay attention to are the asset, which is denoted with the asset code, followed by a colon, and then the issuing address. And then we'll need to spit out all of the different RPC URL, network passphrase, or we can just use the shortcut for the network that we're on. So in our case, I'll be using FutureNet. You can use any network, Stellar network that Soroban is currently running on. So token wrap, and then that asset flag, we remember it was rock, colon, and then the issuing address. And then the network, which is FutureNet. It's worth noting that any account can actually issue it. It doesn't need to be the actual issuing address that signs for this transaction. That'll be happening behind the scenes here. Anyone can wrap an asset once they know the asset code and the asset issuer. So this is one of the reasons that it's important to configure your issuing account before you start publishing that, because anybody can wrap it, start opening up trust lines for it. And if you have other configurations you would like to configure onto your issuing account, you'd want to do that before getting to this point. Just because any trust line that's been opened, you can't retroactively go and make it clawbackable or revocable, things like that. All right, we've wrapped it, and this would be our Stellar Asset contract for this rock KST asset. And we can do Soroban contract, invoke ID, paste in the ID of that new Stellar Asset contract. This is on the Future network. And then we can print out the help flag for this, and it should print out all of our functions here for this Soroban token, as it is mirrored inside the Stellar network. So anything you do here will be reflected over on the Stellar side. They are linked together.
All right, so that is, again, the concept of wrapping, where you've got the Stellar asset is now available as a Soroban token. And so the inside of the Soroban side, when we're wrapping up that token, there is a token interface, which includes all of these functions. And that is kind of coming from within the secret interworkings of Soroban. When you do the token wrap, it's basically taking the exact same interface, and every single time you do a wrap, it's just taking the new asset and asset issuer from that public address, bundling that up into a new Stellar Asset contract. One important thing to note is that, as I mentioned, anyone can actually issue this wrap, but the person who, or the address that does the wrapping is not like the admin, obviously, right? If you wrapped the XLM token, you don't have access to give yourself all of the XLM of the network, but you could be the person who does that. Might be a fun challenge to see who can wrap the XLM asset on the public network first. We'll race to see who can do that. But yeah, by default, these Stellar Asset contracts have an admin who is going to basically be the issuer, right? By default, it'll be the issuer. But you can change that to where on the Stellar side, you've got your signers array, and then on the Soroban side, you can have a different configuration of admins. So that's kind of interesting, where you can have on one side you've got the Stellar signers, and on the Soroban side you've got admins. There's a set admin function for these. All right, so we've wrapped. Let's go ahead and mint.
All right, with our issuing account configured, trust lines opened, we've wrapped our assets. Now it's time to mint the asset. So mint from the issuing account to the user account. We're going to use the Soroban side, but because these assets are now linked, the Stellar asset, the Soroban token, these are linked together. Anything you do either on the Soroban or the Stellar side will be reflected one to the other. We're going to use the Soroban side, and then I'll demonstrate by looking at the laboratory for this account that we have in fact minted tokens from that issuer to the user. So again, we'll be in the Soroban CLI. We'll do Soroban contract invoke, and then the ID. We use that Stellar Asset contract address. The network we'll be using is the FutureNet. We'll go ahead and print out the help for this one and see if we can find that mint command, and then it'll also tell us what the arguments are. There's a to and an amount. So this is the mint command with the argument to and amount. These are in stroops, the smallest amount, so this would be one whole of this rock token. And then the to, we'll put in our user address to mint to this account. And that should be all we need, other than, because we're actually minting, we can't just use the default source account to pay this fee. We actually need the source account of the asset that is the issuer. And we'll paste in that secret key so that the source of the minting is coming from that account that is the issuer of rock token in this case. Okay, we'll run that, and then that one whole of rock token should be minted from the issuer account to the user account. We can see we get an event here. The transaction was successful. We get a nice issued event that's telling us that a mint happened from the issuing account to the user account here for this asset for this much. So if we were to go to our laboratory here and explore our endpoint for that user address and take a look, we'll notice we spent a little bit of our fee here, and then we have one whole of the rock token from that KST issuer. So reflected there, you did it in Soroban, did the minting in Soroban, but it's reflected on the Stellar side. These things are linked together now. How cool is that? Now you could obviously do the exact same thing from the build transaction side. If we were to take the issuing account, get that sequence number, and then do a payment to the user from the issuing account here. Make sure that's a KST. Yes, it is. And this is actually not in stroops. This is in whole, so that would be one. Sign that with the issuing address and submit that. Once that goes through, if we were to look at our endpoints again, we'll notice that instead of one, we now have two. And then we can also go back to our account here, and we could do, instead of mint, we do balance, and then put in the ID. I already know that that is the argument for checking the balance. We don't need to use the source of the issuing account in this case, but I'll just leave it. And if we look this up, we should see that we have 20 million stroops, or the two on the Soroban side. So again, the reflection of these two things, Stellar, Soroban, tied together through this Stellar Asset contract.
Right. So again, I mean, that particular functionality is what makes Soroban for me, where you don't have two separate networks where you've got to wrap an asset and then transfer it over, and now you've got two different balances. These things are linked perfectly together. So we are launching a improved smart contract protocol into a network that already has assets and liquidity and functionality and features. That's pretty awesome. So the last thing we need to do is actually use this asset in a smart contract. I hope you're not telling your users, hey, so there's this really cool tool called the Soroban CLI, and you should use that to get, no, you build a smart contract. So let's cover that.
All right, now that we have got our Stellar asset bridged over, wrapped into the Soroban token with a Stellar asset contract deployed onto FutureNet, we're now ready to kind of take the final step and move that Stellar asset into a Soroban smart contract, where we can then call all of the functions on that asset to do things with it. So I've set up a really basic smart contract here that is basically an airdrop or a faucet contract, which is essentially all it's going to do is anyone who calls it is going to be able to get these 10,000 stroops of this asset and then mint them to their account. So It takes in a token address. So in our case, this will be the stellar asset contract address. And then you can just pass it in a to address, which then calls the mint function on the token client. So the Soroban SDK exposes a token class here that has different objects on it that you can call. We then require auth on that because the owner of this token is going to need to sign off on this mint operation. You can see there's quite a few things that a contract can do, all similar and mirrored to different things you can do on the Stellar side, but these are happening on the Soroban side. But again, because these things are linked now through the Stellar asset contract, when we do a mint, it'll be reflected on the Stellar side, which is fantastic. So I've gone ahead and deployed this contract. I built it in the Soroban CLI. I've deployed it onto the FutureNet, and let's go ahead and call it. So we'll go over here, and this is Soroban contract invoke, and then we pass in the ID of this contract that I deployed, which I just showed you. And this is on the FutureNet currently. We can call a help flag on this, which is going to give us our printout, so we can do airdrop and take a look at the operations here. We take a token address and the to address. And again, the token address here is really the Stellar asset contract, which has our rock token and the issuer of that. And then the to address, which will be, let's just pass in our user address. And then we need to make sure the source here is the source that we would expect. The issuer of this asset, or the admin, which when you wrap a token, the initial admin is the issuer. You can change the admin of the Soroban side of the Stellar asset contract. So then the Stellar side would be controlled by the signers array. Anyone you add to the signers array, if you're familiar with that. And then on the Soroban side, it'll be controlled by the admin address, which can be either a contract or an address. It's pretty cool. We'll go ahead and send that along, and that should mint those 10,000 stroops, or one whole token, from the issuer to the user there. So if we were to look up that address in here, we should notice, I believe I've called this once before, so we'll have 2 of those tokens in there. If we were to call it again, and let me just demonstrate here. If you didn't want the events printout, there's a quiet flag, so this will ignore the events. Since there's no return response on this, it should just be a blank enter and get back to our terminal. And then if we looked at this again, we should go from 2 up to 3, and we do. And then we'll notice over here, if we go to lab and we look up the effects for that user account, we'll actually notice, put it on descending, that the account credited. So we received from the issuing account to the user account this one rock, and we'll notice that happened a couple of times as we sent that over. So pretty cool. You can see it reflected on the Stellar Horizon side, even though this was happening inside Soroban. These two things linked together. Soroban is executing inside of Stellar. So obviously there's all kinds of fantastic implications of being able to utilize Stellar tokens, Stellar assets inside of Soroban through the Stellar asset contract. Yeah, so very cool.
All right, and that really is all there is to it. If it seems simple, it is pretty simple. So I will leave it with that. I have a brain date later. If folks have questions, definitely feel free to come and hang out. I've spent a lot of time with Stellar assets and Soroban tokens, so would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.